she let a stranger stay during Christmas Eve, unaware he was actually a Hell's Angel biker who... She thought it would only be one night. A quiet woman opens her door on Christmas Eve to a wounded stranger in the snow, never guessing he's a Hell's Angel biker with a violent past. He promises he'll be gone by morning. But as the night goes on, something terrifying becomes clear. He can't leave. Dark shapes circle the house. The air turns cold. And the biker finally reveals the truth. Every Christmas Eve, he's bound by a deadly curse to protect the person who lets him in. But when unseen forces come to collect what he owes, her simple act of kindness may cost everything. Will love be enough to save them both? Or was opening the door the biggest mistake of her life? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Sarah Whitfield's boots crunched through the fresh snow as she carried the last of the poinsettias from St. Matthew's Lutheran Church to her car. The vibrant red flowers seemed almost too bright against the deepening gray of the winter afternoon. She carefully placed them on the passenger seat, their scarlet petals a reminder of all the elderly parishioners who hadn't been able to make it to service this year due to the weather. "Another Christmas alone," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. At 32, this wasn't how she had imagined her life would be. The gold band on her left hand caught what little light remained in the day, and her heart tightened as memories of past Christmases flooded back. One spent with her husband before cancer took him 3 years ago, and more recent ones caring for her mother before she passed away last spring. The snow was falling faster now, fat flakes swirling in the strengthening wind. Sarah pulled her worn wool coat tighter and started the drive home. The familiar streets of Milton Falls looked different under the thickening blanket of white, the small Ohio town transforming into something from a Christmas card, beautiful but lonely. Her old station wagon wheezed its way up the hill toward her childhood home. The 2-story Victorian had seen better days, its pale yellow paint peeling in places. But it was all she had left of her family now. The porch light flickered uncertainly as she pulled into the driveway, and just as she reached for her house keys, the entire street went dark. "Perfect timing," Sarah muttered, fumbling with her key ring in the growing darkness. Inside, the house felt especially empty and cold. She moved through the rooms with practiced ease, lighting candles she kept ready for just such occasions. The old house had never quite gotten over its aversion to modern electrical systems. In the kitchen, Sarah set about making a simple dinner by candlelight. The gas stove still worked, at least. As she stirred a pot of soup, she caught her reflection in the window above the sink. A petite woman with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, worry lines starting to show around her eyes despite her relatively young age. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Sarah thought about the poinsettias still in her car, wondering if they would survive the night in this cold. She thought about bringing them in, but the idea of going back out into the storm made her hesitate. Just then, a heavy knock echoed through the house, making her jump. Sarah froze, wooden spoon suspended above the pot. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Who could be out in this weather? She wondered aloud. Living alone had taught her to be cautious, but something, a quiet voice in her heart that she'd learned to trust, urged her forward. Sarah approached the front door, one of the emergency candles casting jumping shadows on the wall. Through the frosted glass panels, she could make out a large, dark shape. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob as her mind ran through all the reasons this was probably a bad idea. "Lord, give me wisdom," she prayed softly, then opened the door. The man on her porch was enormous, well over 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather motorcycle jacket covered in snow. His face was pale beneath his beard, and he was shivering violently. But what made Sarah's heart skip was the blood she could see seeping through his jeans at the knee. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but polite. "My bike went down on the ice about a mile back. I just need to warm up for a bit, if you'd be willing." He swayed slightly as he spoke, and Sarah could see he was trying hard to stay upright. Every rational thought told her to close the door, to tell him to try the police station in town. But that quiet voice inside spoke louder. She thought of the Christmas story, of Mary and Joseph seeking shelter, of the innkeeper who turned them away. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door wider. "Please come in before you freeze to death." She stepped back, making room for him to enter. "I have soup on the stove, and we should look at that leg." The man's relief was visible as he limped inside, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with him. In the candlelight, Sarah could see that despite his intimidating size, his eyes were kind and full of pain. He moved carefully, trying not to drip snow and blood on her floor. "I'm Sarah," she said, closing the door against the howling wind. "The power's out, but I have candles and a first aid kit. Let's get you warm and patched up." The man nodded gratefully, still shivering. "Thank you, ma'am. He paused, as if considering something. "Most people call me Bear." Sarah gestured toward the kitchen, where the soup was still simmering. "Well, Bear, let's get you settled by the stove. It's the warmest place in the house right now." As she helped him to a kitchen chair, Sarah sent up another quick prayer. She didn't know if she was being brave or foolish, but on this cold Christmas Eve, she chose to believe that sometimes God's love arrived in unexpected packages, and that having faith meant acting with courage even when afraid. The candles flickered, casting warm light around the kitchen, and for the first time that day, the old house didn't feel quite so empty. Sarah led the large man into her living room, where several candles created pools of warm light. Now that he was in better lighting, she could see more details, and her breath caught. Beneath the snow-dampened leather jacket was an unmistakable Hell's Angels patch. Dark tattoos snaked up his neck and disappeared into his beard. "Jack?" he said gruffly, noticing her hesitation. Jack called her. "I appreciate you letting me in, ma'am." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set down a candle, her mind racing with stories she'd heard about outlaw bikers. But when she looked at him again, she saw past the intimidating exterior to how he cradled his injured leg, the exhaustion evident in the slump of his broad shoulders. "Let me get the first aid kit," she said softly. "Please, sit down before you fall down." He lowered himself carefully into one of her kitchen chairs, his size making the furniture seem almost dollhouse-like. Sarah busied herself gathering supplies, the kit from under the bathroom sink, clean towels, a bowl of warm water from the still-functioning gas water heater. "I don't mean to be any trouble," Jack said as she returned. "Just need to warm up and rest a bit. I'll be gone by morning." Sarah knelt beside his chair, examining the tear in his jeans. "This needs cleaning at least, may I?" He nodded, watching her with guarded eyes as she carefully cut away the blood-stiffened denim around the wound. The gash wasn't as deep as she'd feared, but road rash had torn up his knee pretty badly. "What happened?" she asked, gently cleaning away dirt and gravel with antiseptic wipes. "Black ice," he said shortly. "Bike went down on that curve by the old Miller farm." He hissed slightly as she dabbed at a particularly tender spot. "Sorry." "Don't apologize. This must hurt terribly." Sarah worked methodically, the familiar motions reminding her of caring for her late husband during his illness. "The roads are getting worse by the minute. They've closed the highway already. It was on the radio before the power went out." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows. Jack's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah saw worry flicker across his face. "The soup's ready," she said, applying the last bandage. "You should eat something warm." When he started to protest, she added firmly, "I made too much anyway. It would just go to waste." Sarah ladled out 2 bowls of the vegetable soup, adding chunks of the bread she'd baked that morning. She set one in front of Jack along with a glass of water, then took her own bowl to the other side of the table. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of spoons against bowls and the storm outside. "This is good," Jack said finally. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Sarah watched him eat, noting how he somehow made even that simple act seem controlled and cautious. "There's more if you want it." After they finished eating, Sarah suggested moving to the living room where the fireplace provided both light and warmth. Jack limped after her, settling into the oversized armchair while she added another log to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and gradually, Sarah felt some of her tension ease. Jack sat quietly, his large hands folded in his lap, staring into the fire. Despite his intimidating appearance, he had shown nothing but politeness and respect since arriving at her door. "I'll get you some blankets," she said, rising. "It gets cold in here at night, especially with the power out." When she returned with an armful of quilts, she found him exactly as she'd left him, as if he was afraid to move or touch anything. She handed him the blankets, noticing how carefully he took them from her, avoiding any contact with her hands. "Thank you," he said again. "I mean it. Most people wouldn't have opened their door to someone like me, especially on Christmas Eve." Sarah settled onto the couch with her own blanket. "What kind of Christian would I be if I turned away someone in need on Christmas Eve?" She smiled slightly. "Though I admit, when I first saw you, I was scared. But sometimes doing the right thing means being brave even when you're afraid." Jack's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You can lock your bedroom door tonight. I'll be gone before dawn. Just need to rest this leg a few hours." "At least wait until the storm passes," Sarah said, though she knew he wouldn't. Men like him didn't stay in one place long. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the old house, a fragile peace had settled. Sarah felt oddly content, knowing that at least on this Christmas Eve, she had done something truly selfless, offered shelter to a stranger in need, just as the innkeeper should have done so long ago. As she watched the flames dance and flicker, Sarah thought about how tomorrow morning she would wake up to an empty house again. Jack would be gone, leaving behind only his thanks and perhaps a small dip in the chair cushion where he'd sat. But for now, on this holy night, she had followed her faith instead of her fear, and that felt like enough of a gift. The candles burned lower, but the fire kept the darkness at bay. In its warm light, Sarah could almost imagine this was how Christmas Eve was meant to feel. Not lonely or sad, but filled with quiet purpose and unexpected grace. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, its chimes echoing through the candle-lit house. Jack shifted in his chair, grimacing as he tried to find a more comfortable position. "I should move to the floor," he muttered. "Don't want to ruin your furniture." "Nonsense," Sarah replied, adjusting a quilt around her shoulders. "That chair has survived worse than a few bloodstains." Jack planted his hands on the armrests and began to push himself up. "Still, I should—" His words cut off in a strangled gasp. His entire body went rigid, muscles cording in his neck as his face contorted in agony. Sarah jumped to her feet. "Jack?" He tried to speak but could only manage a grunt of pain. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the chair, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. Then his leg simply gave out, and he collapsed back into the chair with such force that the wooden frame creaked. "What's wrong?" Sarah rushed to his side, instinctively reaching for his forehead to check for fever. "Is it your injuries?" Jack jerked away from her touch, still breathing heavily. "No," he managed through clenched teeth. "Not injuries. Just happens. Sometimes." "This isn't normal pain," Sarah insisted. "Let me call someone. The hospital isn't far, and surely they have emergency generators." "No." The force of his response made her step back. Jack closed his eyes, seeming to gather himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less intense. "No doctors. No calls. It'll pass." Sarah watched helplessly as another wave of pain racked his body. This was different from his earlier discomfort. The wounds she'd cleaned had been physical. Cuts, bruises, a possibly sprained ankle. But this was something else entirely. "At least tell me what's happening," she pleaded. "Maybe I can help." Jack's laugh was bitter and rough. "Unless you can turn back time until dawn, there's nothing you can do." He drew in a shuddering breath. "I shouldn't have come here. Shouldn't have let you invite me in." Sarah frowned. "Let me invite you in? What do you mean?" "Once invited." He grimaced again, but the worst of the spasm seemed to be passing. "Once invited into a home on Christmas Eve, I can't leave until dawn. Physically can't. Part of the arrangement." "Arrangement?" Sarah's mind struggled to make sense of his words. "I don't understand." A sudden movement outside the window caught her attention. She turned, expecting to see snow falling or tree branches swaying in the wind. Instead, she saw something else. A darkness that seemed deeper than the night, moving in ways that had nothing to do with the storm's patterns. "Don't look," Jack said sharply. "Step away from the window." Sarah backed up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. "What was that?" "Nothing you want to see." Jack's voice was grim. He'd managed to sit up straighter, though pain still lined his face. "They're early tonight. Usually don't show up until closer to midnight." More shadows slid past the windows, their movements fluid and wrong. Sarah found herself moving closer to Jack's chair, away from the glass panes that suddenly seemed far too thin, too fragile. "They can't get in," Jack said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not unless invited, same as me. That's why—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "That's why I needed somewhere to stay, not because of the storm, though that didn't help." Sarah watched as another shadow passed, this one tall and impossibly thin, its edges bleeding into the darkness. "What are they?" "You don't want to know that either." Jack's voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry. I should have kept walking, found an abandoned building or something. But I was hurt, and the storm was getting worse, and when I saw the lights in your windows—" He shook his head. "I've put you in danger. Not from them. They can't get in. But being near this, being part of it even for one night, no one should have to carry that knowledge." Sarah hugged herself, trying to process what she was hearing. The rational part of her mind wanted to dismiss it all. The shadows, Jack's mysterious affliction, talk of arrangements and invitations. But she'd seen too much already to deny the evidence before her eyes. "You're not just a stranded biker, are you?" "No." Jack met her gaze steadily. "But that part's not a lie. I do ride. Did ride, before this. Now I only ride on Christmas Eve, trying to stay ahead of them until I can find somewhere safe to wait out the night." Another shadow passed, and this time Sarah could have sworn she heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a presence, like the pressure change before a storm. Jack tensed, his hands gripping the armrests again, though this time it seemed more from readiness than pain. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. "Usually don't come this close to the windows." Sarah moved to the fireplace and added another log, needing to do something normal, something that made sense. The flames caught quickly, sending new light through the room and pushing back the darkness beyond the windows. For a moment, the shadows seemed to retreat. "This isn't going to be the quiet Christmas Eve I thought it would be, is it?" she asked, trying for lightness but hearing the tremor in her voice. "No," Jack replied softly. "I'm sorry for that too, but I promise you'll be safe. Protecting the people who shelter me, that's part of the arrangement too. Whatever happens tonight, whatever you see or hear, just stay inside. Stay away from the windows. And whatever you do, don't open the door for anyone else. No matter who they seem to be, no matter what they say." Sarah sank back onto the couch, pulling her quilt tight around her shoulders. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood. The shadows continued their strange dance beyond the glass, and Sarah found herself watching them despite Jack's warning, trying to make sense of their movements. She thought of the simple kindness she'd meant to perform by taking in a stranger on Christmas Eve. How proud she'd been of following her, faith instead of her fear. Now, as another shadow slid past the window, this one somehow darker than the others, somehow more aware, she realized that pride had been premature. The night was far from over, and nothing about it would be simple or safe. The grandfather clock struck 8:30, each chime seeming to echo longer than it should. Sarah glanced at Jack, who sat rigid in his chair, eyes fixed on the windows, looking more like a sentinel than a guest. Hours stretched ahead until dawn, and Sarah had a feeling they would be the longest hours of her life. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of her worn quilt as she watched Jack, who remained tense in his chair, his broad shoulders rigid with alertness. The shadows outside had grown bolder, pressing closer to the windows like ink bleeding through paper. The silence in the room felt heavy, waiting to be broken. "I need to tell you something," Jack finally said, his voice rough. "About why I'm really here, why they're out there." He paused, running a hand over his face. "It's not a pretty story." Sarah drew her legs up beneath her on the couch, trying to find comfort in its familiar embrace. "I think we're past pretty stories now," Jack nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "It was 5 years ago, Christmas Eve. I was with my club, the Hells Angels. We were having a party at our clubhouse, nothing special, just bikes, beer, and brotherhood." His voice caught slightly on the last word. "We didn't know we had enemies that night. Didn't know we'd been marked." The fire popped loudly, making Sarah jump. Jack didn't even flinch. They came at midnight, 3 carloads of rivals armed to the teeth. They'd planned it perfect, blocked all the exits, cut the power, started shooting through the windows. His hands tightened on the armrests. 23 of my brothers were there that night. 22 died in the first 5 minutes. "And you survived," Sarah whispered. "I shouldn't have." Jack's voice was hollow. "I took 2 bullets to the chest, 1 to the gut. Was lying there in my own blood, watching my friends die around me, knowing I was next." He swallowed hard. "That's when I heard it. A voice offering me a chance, a bargain." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "What kind of bargain?" "The kind you make when you're desperate and dying. The kind that saves your life but takes your soul." Jack finally looked at her, his eyes haunted. "I said yes, of course I said yes. And suddenly I could breathe again, could stand. The bullets just fell out of me. But by then, everyone else was dead. and I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Outside, a shadow passed so close to the window that Sarah could almost make out features in its darkness, features that shouldn't exist. She pulled the quilt tighter. Every Christmas Eve since then, it's the same, Jack continued. I start riding at sunset, drawn to somewhere specific, though I never know where until I get there. And someone innocent, someone with faith, always lets me in. Has to let me in. That's part of it. Then they come, trying to collect what I owe. The shadows, Sarah said. They're not shadows, not really. They're... Jack shook his head. There aren't words for what they are, not in any language I know, but they want what was promised to them. My soul, my life, the debt that should have been paid 5 years ago. The house creaked around them, wood and glass protesting against an unseen pressure. Sarah felt her faith wavering, struggling against the impossible reality of what she was hearing. Yet she couldn't deny the evidence of her own eyes, couldn't ignore the malevolent presence gathering outside her home. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Why my house?" "Because you still believe," Jack said simply. "In goodness, in God, in helping strangers on Christmas Eve. People like you, they're rare now. Precious. The kind worth protecting." "Protecting?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "What do you mean?" Jack leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's the other part of the bargain. Whoever shelters me, I have to protect them. With everything I have. Because they'll try to take you too. Try to claim 2 souls instead of 1. That's why it has to be someone with faith. Someone strong enough to resist them until dawn." The implications of his words sank in slowly, horror spreading through Sarah's chest like ice. "My act of kindness, letting you in, wasn't random," Jack finished quietly. "You were chosen, just like all the others before you, and now we both have to survive until morning, or everything I've fought for these past 5 years means nothing." A low, keening sound rose from beyond the walls. Not wind, not animal, but something that made Sarah's very soul recoil. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving between her and the windows despite his earlier weakness. "They're getting impatient," he growled. "Usually takes them longer to get this aggressive." He glanced back at Sarah, his expression grim. "Whatever happens next, whatever you see or hear, you have to trust me. Can you do that?" Sarah looked up at him, this massive, tattooed biker who had brought darkness to her door, who had survived death through a devil's bargain, who now stood as her unlikely guardian against forces she never knew existed. Her faith, already tested by loss and grief, faced its greatest challenge yet. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said honestly. "But I still believe in God, and I have to believe He brought you here for a reason." Jack's features softened slightly. "That's all I can ask for." He turned back to the windows as another unearthly cry pierced the night. "Stay behind me. And remember, no matter what, don't open the door. Don't even look outside. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen." The house shuddered again, and Sarah felt the darkness pressing in from all sides, testing, searching for ways, inside. Her simple Christmas Eve had become a nightmare, her act of charity a test of survival. As she watched Jack take up his protective stance, she silently prayed for strength, not just to survive the night, but to keep her faith intact in the face of these revelations that threatened everything she believed. The grandfather clock struck 9, each chime seeming to embolden the shadows outside. The night stretched ahead like an endless tunnel, with dawn feeling impossibly far away. Sarah clutched her quilt closer, trying to find comfort in its familiar warmth as the darkness gathered its strength for whatever would come next. The darkness deepened as night fully settled over the old house. Sarah watched the flames in the fireplace slowly diminish, each pop and crackle of burning wood making her jump. The temperature had dropped considerably. She could see her breath forming little clouds in the air, despite being indoors. Jack paced between the windows and doors with measured steps, his massive frame casting long shadows across the walls. His eyes never stopped scanning, checking every possible entry point. The vigilance in his movements reminded Sarah of a caged tiger she'd once seen at the zoo. Powerful, alert, and deeply unsettled. "The fire's getting low," Sarah murmured, wrapping her arms around herself. "I should add more wood." "I'll do it," Jack said immediately, moving to block her path to the woodpile by the door. "You stay away from the windows." As he carefully added logs to the dying flames, Sarah noticed how his shoulders tensed at every sound from outside. The wind had died down completely now, leaving an unnatural stillness that made every creak of the old house sound amplified. A sharp scratching noise suddenly cut through the silence, like fingernails dragging across glass. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Jack whirled toward the nearest window, moving with impossible speed. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn his eyes gleamed with an inner light. "Get back," he growled, his voice deeper than before. The scratching intensified, and dark shapes pressed against the window pane. Not shadows exactly, but something worse, something that seemed to drink in what little light remained in the room. Jack planted his feet and raised his hands. Energy seemed to ripple through him, and when he spoke again, it was in a language Sarah had never heard before, ancient and powerful. The shadows recoiled as if burned, shrieking in voices that made her want to cover her ears. Without thinking, Sarah began to pray out loud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." The familiar words centered her, pushing back against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She noticed Jack glancing at her, something like respect flickering across his face as she continued, praying. When the shadows finally retreated, the silence felt deafening. Jack sagged slightly, leaning against the wall as if drained. "You okay?" Sarah asked softly. He nodded. "Takes a lot out of me, fighting them like that. But your prayers, they helped, made them weaker somehow." Sarah settled back in her chair, pulling the old quilt tighter around her shoulders. "My husband used to say that fear and faith can't occupy the same space. I didn't really understand what he meant until now." Jack's expression softened slightly at the mention of her husband. "How long has he been gone?" 3 years this spring," Sarah said, touching her empty ring finger. "Car accident. 1 minute we were planning our future, the next." She trailed off, surprised to find herself sharing such personal details with a stranger. "Sorry, you probably don't want to hear about all that." "It's okay," Jack said, lowering himself carefully into the chair opposite her. Loss is loss. Doesn't matter who you are or how it happens. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. "Did you lose someone too?" Jack stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "My whole family when I was 10. House fire. Ended up in the system after that, bouncing from home to home until I aged out. Found the bikers when I was 18. First real family I'd had since the fire." His mouth twisted. "Lost them too, the night I made my bargain." Sarah felt her heart ache for the lonely child he must have been. "Is that why you agreed to the arrangement, to save your new family?" "Tried to," he said heavily. "Failed. I was the only one who survived that night. Sometimes I think that's the real curse, not the bargain itself, but having to live with what happened." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own memories of loss. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across their faces. "I used to love Christmas," Sarah admitted quietly. "But after Tom died, it just became something to get through. Mother tried to keep our old traditions alive, but when she passed away last month..." She blinked back tears. "I've been telling myself that joy isn't meant for me anymore, that I should just accept being alone." "Yeah," Jack said roughly. "Know that feeling." Another scratching sound came from outside, but it seemed more distant now, as if testing rather than threatening. Jack tensed, but didn't move from his chair. "They're trying to wear us down," he explained. "Make us tired, scared, vulnerable. That's when they're strongest, when we start losing hope." Sarah pulled her legs up onto the chair, curling into herself. "How do you keep going? Knowing what's out there, what you face every year?" Jack was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Honestly, I didn't think I had anything left to live for after that night. Just existed, going through the motions. But then I started meeting people, like you. Good people who still believe in helping strangers, in doing the right thing even when it's scary. Made me think maybe there's still something worth protecting in this world." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Sarah saw something shift in Jack's expression, a softening of his hard edges, a glimpse of the person he might have been before tragedy and darkness claimed him. For the first time since he arrived, she felt truly safe in his presence. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" she said with a small smile. "Both convinced we're beyond joy, both just trying to survive another Christmas Eve." "Maybe," Jack replied, and there was an unfamiliar warmth in his voice. "Or maybe we're both wrong about that." The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through the house. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, watching and waiting. But in the circle of firelight, something fragile had begun to take root, a connection forged through shared pain and unexpected understanding, a reminder that even in the darkest night, no one is truly alone. The grandfather clock's chimes faded into silence, and suddenly the house felt different. The howling wind that had rattled the windows all evening gradually diminished to a whisper. The menacing shadows that had been creeping closer throughout the night seemed to withdraw, leaving only the gentle dance of candlelight on the walls. Sarah lifted her head, uncurling slightly from her defensive posture. "It's quieter." "They do this sometimes," Jack said, his broad shoulders still tense as he scanned the darkness beyond the windows. "Like a cat playing with its prey. Gives us false security." But even he seemed to relax marginally as the minutes ticked by without any supernatural disturbance. The fire crackled peacefully in the hearth, and the candles burned steady and bright. Sarah stood slowly, drawing the quilt around her shoulders like a shawl. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared into the hallway before Jack could protest. He listened intently to her footsteps as she climbed the stairs, ready to move at the first sign of danger. She returned a few minutes later carrying a small cardboard box, dust coating its worn corners. "If we're going to be up all night anyway?" She set the box down and opened it carefully, revealing a small tabletop Christmas tree, no more than 18 inches tall. This was Mother's. She put it up every year, even when she was too sick to manage the big tree. Jack watched as she lifted the little artificial tree from its box. Its branches were slightly bent from years of storage, but there was something endearing about its imperfection. Sarah set it on the coffee table and began gently spreading out the branches. "Would you—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "Would you help me decorate it? There are some ornaments in here too." Jack stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He moved his chair closer to the table, his large hands looking almost comically oversized as he reached into the box and carefully lifted out a delicate glass ball. "My mother collected these," Sarah explained, unwrapping tissue paper from around a tiny silver star. "One new ornament every year. She could tell you the story behind each one." "What's the story behind this one?" Jack asked, holding up a small ceramic angel with slightly chipped wings. A smile touched Sarah's lips. "That was the year I was born. Dad bought it because he said I was their little angel." She hung the star on one of the upper branches. "Though I'm sure I didn't feel very angelic to them during my teenage years." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for ornaments. Sarah couldn't help noticing how gently Jack handled each decoration, as if trying to make up for his imposing size and strength. "This one's seen better days," he commented, carefully straightening a bent hook on a faded glass ball. "Mother always said the worn ones had the best stories," Sarah replied. "Like people, I suppose. Our scars show where we've been." Jack's hands stilled for a moment. "Some scars go deeper than others." "Yes," Sarah said quietly, "but they're proof we survived." As they continued decorating, Sarah found herself sharing memories attached to various ornaments, her father teaching her to ride a bike, her mother's famous Christmas cookies, the year they got snowed in and had to eat canned soup for Christmas dinner. Simple, ordinary moments that suddenly felt precious in the telling. "What about you?" she asked Jack. "Do you have any good Christmas memories? From before?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "There was this one year, I must have been about 7. Dad worked 2 jobs, money was tight, but somehow they managed to get me this little toy motorcycle. Nothing fancy, probably from a discount store. But man, I thought it was the greatest thing ever." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Rode that thing all over the house until the wheels fell off." Sarah could picture it, a small boy, not yet touched by tragedy, lost in the simple joy of a cherished toy. Her heart ached for all that had been stolen from him. "No one's ever done this before," Jack said suddenly, his voice rough. "Done what?" "This." He gestured at the tree, the ornaments, the peaceful scene they'd created. "Treated me like I'm just a person. Usually they're too scared, or they want something from me. Protection, revenge, whatever. But you—" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You offered me soup and bandages. You're sharing your memories, your mother's treasures. Why?" Sarah considered his question carefully. "Because that's what Christmas is supposed to be about. Opening our hearts, showing kindness to strangers. Because everyone deserves to feel human, to feel welcomed." She paused, then added softly, "And because I think maybe we both needed this tonight." The last ornament, a small crystal dove, caught the candlelight as Jack hung it on a lower branch. The little tree wasn't perfectly balanced, and some of the ornaments were clustered too close together, but somehow that made it more beautiful, more real. Sarah found a stub of candle in the box and placed it carefully beside the tree. When she lit it, the warm glow transformed the humble decorations into something magical. Tiny points of light reflected in the glass ornaments, creating a constellation of stars on their coffee table. They sat back in their chairs, admiring their handiwork. The grandfather clock ticked softly, marking peaceful moments instead of fearful ones. Outside, the snow fell gently now, no longer driven by supernatural winds. "Thank you," Jack said quietly, still gazing at the tree. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like." When she looked questioningly at him, he added, "To be human, to belong somewhere, even if it's just for a little while." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding exactly what he meant. Since losing Tom, she'd been going through the motions of life, holding everyone at arm's length, convinced that joy and connection were things of the past. But sitting here in the candlelight, sharing this peaceful moment with an unlikely companion, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel again. A sense of grace, of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The little tree glowed between them like a promise, its light pushing back the darkness that waited beyond their walls. For this moment at least, love and kindness seemed not just enough, but everything. The peaceful moment shattered like glass. The candle flame suddenly stretched tall and thin, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. A deep, bone-chilling cold seeped through the house, making Sarah's breath visible in the air. The grandfather clock stopped ticking. Jack leapt to his feet, positioning himself between Sarah and the darkened hallway. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tight with dread. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, her heart pounding. "The collectors?" Before Jack could answer, the front door swung open without a sound. No wind, no creak of hinges. It simply opened to the night. Two figures glided into the living room, their movements too smooth to be human. They wore what looked like business suits, but the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their faces were pleasant, unremarkable, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Jack Calder," the first one spoke, its voice like dry leaves rustling. "The hour approaches." "You can't have her," Jack growled, his massive frame tensed for battle. The second collector tilted its head slightly. "We operate according to ancient law. You know this. The debt must be settled." Sarah stood on shaking legs, fighting down her terror. "What debt? Please, just tell us what you want." Both collectors turned to look at her with empty eyes. The temperature dropped further, frost crystallizing on the windows. "The terms were set years ago," the first one explained, its tone eerily pleasant. "When Jack Calder lay dying among his fallen brothers, he called out, not to God, but to older powers. He bargained his soul for survival." "But that's not all," the second continued. "The bargain included a chance at redemption. Each Christmas Eve, he is drawn to protect one chosen soul. If true love and sacrifice are freely given, the debt can be cleared." Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand. "Then why hasn't it been settled before? All these years?" "Because the price is steep," Jack said roughly, not taking his eyes off the collectors. "If I refuse to give myself up, they take the innocent soul instead. I couldn't let anyone make that sacrifice, not for me." Time seemed to slow, the air becoming thick and heavy. Sarah felt like she was underwater, struggling to process what she was hearing. The first collector spoke again. "The choice must be made freely, without coercion. Love freely given, sacrifice freely chosen. These are the terms." "And if he refuses?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then your soul is forfeit at dawn," the second collector stated matter-of-factly. "Your act of kindness bound you to this moment. The debt will be paid, one way or another." Jack's shoulders sagged, the weight of years of guilt visible in his stance. "I never wanted this. Never wanted anyone else to pay for my mistakes." The collectors moved in perfect synchronization, stepping back toward the door. "We will return at dawn for the final accounting," they said in unison. "Choose wisely." They glided out into the night, leaving the door open behind them. Snow drifted in, settling on the floor like ash. Jack stumbled to the fireplace, bracing himself against the mantel, his breathing ragged. Sarah sank back into her chair, her mind spinning. The little Christmas tree still glowed on the table, but its warmth seemed mocking now. All her small acts of kindness throughout the evening, the soup, the bandages, the decorations, took on a terrible new meaning. "I'm so sorry," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have warned you, should have stayed away, but I can't. I have no control over where I'm drawn each year." "How many?" Sarah asked. "How many others have faced this choice?" 12. He turned to face her, his eyes haunted. 12 Christmas Eves. Some tried to fight, some tried to run. One even tried to shoot me, thinking it would break the cycle. Nothing worked. In the end, I couldn't let them sacrifice themselves. I just couldn't. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. "So you've carried this burden alone, year after year." "It was my choice, my debt." He slumped into the other chair, looking utterly defeated. "I never meant for anyone else to pay the price." The grandfather clock remained silent, but Sarah could feel time slipping away. Outside, the storm had settled into an eerie calm, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Dawn would come, and with it, a terrible choice. She looked at Jack, this man who had endured 12 years of torment rather than let another soul be taken in his place, who had suffered alone rather than accept sacrifice from others, who, even now, was more concerned with her fate than his own. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her like a physical thing. All her thoughts of simple kindness and Christmas spirit seemed naive now, in the face of such devastating consequences. The collector's words echoed in her mind. Love freely given, sacrifice freely chosen. They sat in silence as the candles burned lower, each lost in their own despair, while the night crept inexorably toward dawn. The grandfather clock struck 3, its chime breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the living room. Sarah watched as Jack paced near the window, his massive frame casting long shadows in the candlelight. The storm outside had calmed to gentle snowfall, deceptively peaceful given what waited in the darkness. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said softly, though she knew her words were futile. "There has to be another way." Jack stopped pacing and turned to face her. In the flickering light, his features seemed carved from stone, but his eyes held a gentleness she hadn't noticed before. "There isn't. Not this time." "But why?" Her voice cracked. "Why sacrifice yourself for someone you barely know?" He moved to sit in the chair across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. "Because for 12 years I've been running from what I am, what I did. Every Christmas Eve I watched good people suffer because of my choices." He looked down at his weathered hands. "Maybe this is why I was drawn here, to finally make things right." Sarah's throat tightened. "By dying?" "By choosing," he corrected quietly. "For the first time since that night, I'm choosing freely. Not running, not hiding, just choosing." The fire crackled softly, throwing warm light across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white. Sarah's gaze drifted to the small Christmas tree they had decorated together just hours ago, its tiny lights twinkling bravely against the darkness. "Will you pray with me?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. "Not for rescue, just for strength." Jack hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I haven't prayed since I was a kid. Not sure I remember how." "There's no wrong way," Sarah said, reaching out to take his hand. His fingers were rough and calloused against hers, but they were warm. Human. "We just talk to God." They bowed their heads together in the quiet room. Sarah's voice was steady as she began. "Lord, we come to you not asking for miracles or escape, but for the courage to face what's ahead. Help us understand the meaning of true sacrifice, of love freely given." Jack's hand tightened on hers as she spoke. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment before adding in a rough whisper, "And please, keep her safe. That's all I ask." The clock ticked steadily onward. 4 o'clock came and went. The candles burned lower, wax pooling on the tables. Sarah made fresh coffee, more for something to do than from any desire to drink it. They talked quietly about small things, favorite Christmas memories, dreams they'd once had, places they'd always wanted to see. "My husband used to say that love was a choice you make every day," Sarah said, warming her hands around her coffee mug. "I never really understood what he meant until now." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your husband sounds like a wise man." "He was." She smiled sadly. "He taught me that sometimes the biggest acts of love look like ordinary choices, like inviting a stranger in from the cold." "Or giving up everything to keep that stranger safe," Jack added softly. As 5 o'clock approached, Jack stood and walked to where his leather jacket hung by the door. He ran his fingers over the worn leather, the patches, the Hells Angels insignia that had once meant everything to him. "Leave it," Sarah said quietly. "Leave something behind." He nodded, understanding the gesture for what it was, a final confession, a letting go of who he had been. Without the jacket, he looked different, younger somehow, more vulnerable. The first hint of pre-dawn light began to creep into the sky, a pale glow barely visible through the windows. Jack moved to the front door, his hand resting on the knob. "Thank you," he said, turning to look at Sarah one last time, "for showing me what kindness looks like, what love looks like." His voice grew rough. "I forgot somewhere along the way, but you reminded me." Sarah stood, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You're a good man, Jack Calder. Don't let anyone tell you different." He gave her a small, sad smile. Then, squaring his shoulders, he opened the door and stepped out into the snow. The pre-dawn air rushed in, cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of winter and endings. Sarah watched from the doorway as he walked steadily into the yard, his boot prints marking the fresh snow. The darkness seemed to gather around him, waiting. But he didn't hesitate or look back. Each step was purposeful, chosen, as he went to meet whatever waited in the shadows. Jack's boots crunched in the pristine snow as he walked away from the warmth of Sarah's house. The pre-dawn air bit at his exposed arms, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on what lay ahead in the darkness. They emerged like smoke, solidifying into human shapes. The collectors. Their forms were black as pitch against the white snow, moving with an unnatural grace that made his skin crawl. They circled him slowly, their presence heavy with ancient power and cold intent. "You have chosen to fulfill the debt," one of them spoke, its voice like ice cracking. "Yes," Jack's voice was steady, even as his heart hammered in his chest. "I choose this freely, not because I have to, but because I want to." Behind him, he could sense Sarah watching from the doorway. He didn't turn to look. He couldn't bear to see her tears. Instead, he lifted his chin and faced the darkness that had haunted him for 12 years. "You understand the price?" another collector asked, its form shifting like smoke. "Your life, your soul, everything you are or could have been." "I understand." Jack's words formed small clouds in the freezing air. "And I give it willingly, for her, because sometimes love means choosing to let go." The collectors moved closer, their circle tightening. The air grew colder, frost crackling across the ground beneath their feet. Jack could feel their power pressing against him, testing his resolve, searching for any hint of hesitation or fear. But there was none. For the first time since that bloody night 12 years ago, when he'd made his desperate bargain, Jack felt at peace. This wasn't an ending forced upon him. It was a choice made in love. And in that choice, he found a freedom he'd never known. "Then let it be done," the first collector intoned, reaching out with hands like shadows. Jack closed his eyes, ready to accept his fate. But something unexpected happened. A warmth began to spread through his chest, different from anything he'd ever felt before. It wasn't the heat of fire or sunlight, it was something deeper, more profound, like love made tangible. The collectors hesitated, their forms wavering. "What is this?" one hissed, drawing back slightly. The warmth grew stronger, radiating outward from Jack's heart. Where it touched the darkness, the shadows seemed to recoil. A soft light began to emanate from him, growing brighter with each beat of his heart. "No," another collector rasped. "This is not possible. The debt must be paid." "It is being paid," a new voice spoke, neither Jack's nor the collector's, but something vast and ancient and kind. "But not with death, with love freely given." The light grew blinding, and Jack felt something inside him shift and change. The weight of his curse, the chains of his bargain, they were dissolving like frost in sunlight. The collectors writhed, their shadowy forms beginning to break apart. "The law demands payment," they shrieked in unison. "And it has been given," the voice replied, "not in blood or death, but in the willing sacrifice of one heart for another, in love chosen freely, without condition or demand. This is the highest law." The light exploded outward in a silent wave of pure white. Jack felt it pass through him like a cleansing fire, burning away 12 years of darkness and shame. Around him, the collectors' forms shattered like black glass, their ancient power broken by something far older and stronger. From the doorway, Sarah watched in awe as the light engulfed Jack's form. For one terrible moment, she thought she'd lost him. That, the sacrifice had been accepted, and he was gone forever. But as the light began to fade and her vision cleared, she saw him still standing there in the snow. The darkness was gone. The oppressive weight of supernatural presence that had filled the air all night had vanished. In its place was only the clean, crisp feeling of a winter dawn approaching. Jack stood motionless, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the lightening sky. Snow continued to fall softly around him, each flake catching the first hint of dawn's light. The silence was absolute, not the threatening quiet of before, but the peaceful stillness of a world made new. Sarah held her breath, afraid to move or speak. She watched as Jack slowly opened his eyes and looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. He flexed his fingers, wonder crossing his face. The curse was broken. The debt was paid. Not through death or damnation, but through the simple, profound power of love freely chosen. The eastern sky began to lighten, purple fading to pink and gold. A new day was dawning, the first day of many that Jack never thought he'd see. He remained standing in the snow, letting the peace of the moment wash over him, as the world around him awakened to Christmas morning. Sarah stayed in the doorway, her hand pressed to her heart, watching as the rising sun painted the snow-covered world in shades of gold. The night's darkness was gone, burned away by a light more powerful than any shadow. In its place was left only silence and hope and the promise of a new beginning. Sarah stirred on the living room couch, her neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle. Golden sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, casting dancing patterns across the floor. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, trying to sort reality from dreams. The events of the night felt distant and hazy, like scenes from a half-remembered movie. The old grandfather clock in the corner showed 7:15 in the morning. Christmas morning. She sat up slowly, noticing Jack's biker jacket still draped over the chair by the cold fireplace. Her heart skipped a beat as memories of the night came flooding back. The collectors, the sacrifice, the blinding light. "Jack," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The house remained silent. Sarah pushed herself up from the couch, her legs unsteady. She made her way to the front door, her hand hesitating on the knob. Fear and hope warred in her chest as she slowly pulled it open. The world outside was transformed. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, sparkling like diamond dust in the morning sun. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind an almost supernatural stillness. And there, standing in the middle of her snow-covered yard, was Jack. He stood with his face tilted toward the sun, eyes closed, snowflakes melting on his upturned face. Something about him was different, softer, lighter somehow. The hard lines of tension that had marked his features were smoothed away. "Jack?" Sarah whispered, hardly daring to believe he was real. He turned at the sound of her voice, and Sarah gasped. The intricate tattoos that had covered his arms were changed, faded and silvered, more like old scars than ink. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. The haunted, guarded look was gone, replaced by something she'd only caught glimpses of before. Peace. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm free." She rushed down the porch steps, not feeling the cold snow beneath her feet. Jack caught her as she threw her arms around him, holding her tight as tears began to fall. "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out against his chest. "When the light came, I thought—" "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I thought so too. But something happened. Something I can't explain." He pulled back slightly, looking down at his transformed arms. "The curse is gone. All of it. I can feel it." Sarah reached out tentatively to touch one of the silvered marks on his arm. Where dark ink had once formed chains of guilt and obligation, there were now only faint traces, like old wounds finally healed. In the distance, church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying across the snow-covered town. The sound brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of joy. How long had it been since she'd truly heard the beauty in those bells? How long since she'd felt real hope on Christmas morning? "It's really over?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Jack nodded, wonder still evident in his expression. "The collectors are gone. The debt is paid. But not the way they wanted, not with death or darkness, with something stronger." "Love," Sarah said softly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Because you chose to sacrifice yourself out of love, not fear." "Yes," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in my life, I made a choice that wasn't about survival or obligation. I chose love, and somehow, that was enough." The church bells continued their joyful chorus, filling the morning air with their song of hope and renewal. Sarah and Jack stood together in the snow, bathed in winter sunlight, as the weight of the night's darkness fell away completely. The world felt new, washed clean by more than just the fallen snow. For both of them, the widow who had lost her joy, and the cursed man who never thought he deserved it, hope had returned, wrapped in the unexpected gift of Christmas morning. Inside the warm kitchen, Sarah busied herself making pancakes while Jack sat at the old wooden table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The morning light streamed through the frost-edged windows, making everything seem softer, more gentle. "I haven't had homemade pancakes since I was a kid," Jack admitted, watching as Sarah flipped another golden circle onto a growing stack. The familiar smell of butter and maple syrup filled the kitchen. "Well, they're nothing fancy," Sarah said, bringing the plate to the table. "Just my mother's recipe, but on Christmas morning sometimes simple things are the best." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the clink of forks against plates and the distant scrape of snowplows clearing the streets outside. Jack's shoulders, usually tensed for danger, remained relaxed. "I don't know who I am anymore," he finally said, staring down at his plate. "Without the curse, without the club, I've spent so many years being Iron Calder that I'm not sure I remember how to be just Jack." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes we need to start fresh." "Where would I even go?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "You could stay," Sarah said simply. When Jack looked up sharply, she continued. "Not because you have to, not because I'm afraid, but because you want to. Because maybe we both need a chance to remember who we are." Before Jack could respond, a knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah went to answer it, finding Mrs. Henderson from next door clutching a Christmas casserole. "We saw your lights were back on," the older woman said, then peered past Sarah to where Jack sat at the kitchen table. To Sarah's surprise, Mrs. Henderson's face showed no fear, only the warmth of a small-town neighbor checking in after a storm. More neighbors stopped by throughout the morning, each bringing food or concern or simple greetings. Each time, Jack tensed less, spoke more. When the Miller family's youngest daughter offered him a candy cane with a gap-toothed smile, his whole face softened in a way Sarah hadn't seen before. "They're just kind," he said wonderingly after the Millers left. "They don't want anything. They're not afraid." "That's what community can be," Sarah replied. "That's what life can be, when we let it." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah's snow-covered yard as Jack worked steadily on the broken fence. His strong hands moved with purpose, hammering each board back into place. The old leather jacket was gone, replaced by a borrowed work coat that somehow made him look more himself than he'd ever been. Sarah wrapped her hands around a warm mug of tea as she watched from the porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath her feet as she shifted her weight, observing how naturally Jack fit into this peaceful scene. The melting snow dripped steadily from the eaves, each drop marking the passage of time and the washing away of what was. "You don't have to fix that today," she called out. "It's Christmas." Jack paused, wiping his brow despite the cold. "I want to," he said simply. "Feels good to build something instead of breaking it." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. The fence had been broken for months, ever since a summer storm had torn it apart. Like so many things in her life, she'd let it stay broken, too wrapped up in grief to care about repairs. "I've been thinking," Jack said, setting down his hammer and walking toward the porch. "There's a mechanics shop on Main Street that's hiring. Owner's looking to retire soon." He cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain. "I'm good with engines. Always have been. Maybe it's time to use that skill for something honest." "You're staying?" Sarah asked softly, hope warming her voice. "If you'll have me," Jack replied. "Not in your house, of course. There's a room above the shop, but in town. Near enough to help with repairs, or just near enough?" Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd grown used to. These felt like spring rain instead of winter frost. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow melt in patches, revealing the dormant grass beneath. Each revealed patch seemed like a promise of growth to come. "You know what's strange?" Sarah mused. 24 hours ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life would be. Small and quiet and... She hesitated. lonely. Then I opened that door. Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest choices, he said. One act of kindness. As the sun began to set on Christmas Day, they stood together on the porch, watching the last light paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. The broken fence was mended, stronger now at the repaired places. Like them, it had been broken, but not beyond repair. Like them, it just needed someone to believe it was worth fixing. The church bells rang in the distance, marking the end of Christmas Day. But for Sarah and Jack, it felt more like a beginning. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.